I'm Richard D. Hall. This week's guest is an ex-principal intelligence analyst from South Yorkshire Police. In 2010, having learned about the possible involvement by authorities in both 9/11 and 7/7 terrorist attacks, whilst compiling the annual strategic threat assessment for South Yorkshire Police, he alerted senior management to a major problem on the strategic threat from terrorism, that being the threat of an internal tyranny, which far exceeded the threat from any other source, such as Islamic terrorism or the Irish Dissident Republic. These views eventually led to his dismissal. He is Tony Farrell, and he joins me today to talk about his emerging story. Welcome, Tony.
Thank you, Richard.
And thank you for coming on board. Now, Tony, to get the ball rolling, if you can just give me some brief information on your qualifications first. What did you study? Because you're a graduate, yeah?
Yes, that's right. Going back in 1984, I graduated at Sheffield, Hallam University, Sheffield Polytechnic in those days with a BSc in Applied Statistics. Mm-hmm. That was in 1984. I then worked within Sheffield City Council quickly into a managerial position, and then in 1993 joined the police. Mm-hmm. While I was at the police, I did two extra postgraduate qualifications. Firstly, a postgraduate diploma in management studies that was sponsored by the police, and secondly, a postgraduate diploma in criminal intelligence and analysis at Manchester University.
Right. So you've been an intelligence analyst for how long?
Since 1998, sorry.
Okay. Now, just as a broad overview, I think there are 43 forces in the UK.
That's correct. In England
Each
and Wales,
one of them employs intelligence analysts for a range of purposes, I guess. But each one has one single principal intelligence analyst.
That's normally the case, yes.
So you were the principal intelligence analyst at South Yorkshire Police. So
yeah, the head of profession of intelligence analysts is another way of describing that.
Okay. Now then, you were asked to produce an annual threat assessment.
That's correct.
This was due to be handed in, I believe, last year in July.
That's correct.
You learned about certain things to do with 9/11 and 7/7, and you believed that they represented some kind of threat. So can you explain that for us? What led you to information about these terrorist attacks?
Right. Well, there are two components. There was my work for the police and my homework were different, and both came into horrible conflict. So I was asked to do a strategic threat assessment matrix, a simplified model of a strategic threat assessment. And I'd always assumed that the terrorist threat was as government narrative would have us believe. So I believed the story of 9/11.
As I think most people did on the day it happened.
That's right, yeah. And I'd never had any reason to doubt that. And likewise with 7/7. And that was very much the case in the lead-up to when the assignment was due, which was on the 8th of July.
2010.
That's correct, yes. So I was preparing all my one of my major assignments, happily not anticipating any problem. However, I have interests in my home study in geopolitical events and the history of the church. And in looking at that, I came across information on the New World Order. I didn't like the looks of, and researched more into that just as an interest, outside interest. But it was at that point, shortly before the assignment was due, that I came across, without looking really for it, information on 9/11, which was so utterly compelling, or damning, about the actual official narrative. And using my analytical skills, it wasn't difficult to balance one against the other. And I came to the belief and conclusion that 9/11 was a massive inside job false flag attack. And that clearly posed me a problem with completing one component part of the strategic threat assessment, which was the terrorism aspect. But a minister I spoke to just prior to the deadline suggested I look into 7/7. It was speculative. I didn't, in my wildest dreams, believe that could be the case.
So this Sadly, is the 7/7 London bombings of 2005.
2005.
56 people died.
Yes.
So you looked to see whether there was information.
I put the alternative hypothesis to the test and researched in my own time, in my home study, everything and anything I could find. And it wasn't long before I came to the conclusion that, sadly, 7/7, in my opinion, was a monstrous lie, perpetrated by our own intelligence services with clear government complicity at the time.
Okay. Now, so you then saw that as the major threat and wanted to include this in your threat assessment.
Well, clearly, if I expect all the expectation was that I would follow the norm and actually articulate a threat that was from Islamic terrorists and Al Qaeda, not drawing from any particular internal source other than government document narrative on that issue. This was a strategic threat, so it would be something that would support the government policy at the time, the contest, the prevent strategy that police forces were enforcing. But that was horribly contradictory to my belief, my genuinely held beliefs, that wasn't necessarily the case. In fact, the case was the exact opposite of the worst possible kind, internal tyranny.
So you were due to present your report on the 8th of July last year.
That's correct, yes.
But because of these reservations, you thought that you'd flag them up with a detective chief inspector? Is that
detective superintendent.
Sorry, detective superintendent.
A director of intelligence, yes.
Right. So who did you report to directly, Tony, first?
I reported, my relationship was most closely with the director of intelligence, and I had a line management responsibility to do a detective chief inspector for day-to-day reporting. Right. But for the strategic work, it was always for the director of intelligence.
And where would the director of intelligence be based at?
He would be based in headquarters of South Yorkshire Police, right, in the specialist crime services.
Right. So you thought, look, I want to mention the threat of internal tyranny in my report because you believed that this was the bigger threat.
Well, the first thing I needed to do, I felt obliged to do, is given my beliefs, formulated by my own home study, that ran horribly contradictory to the government narrative. The first thing I felt compelled to do was to alert management to that predicament that I was in. That I know, as the analyst tasked to do the threat assessment, yes, my assessment of threat was not in accordance with their conceptual model of threat. Yes. If their conceptual model of threat was for Islamic terrorists being a major threat to the UK citizens.
So you presented the detective superintendent with, well, these two sheets that you drew up about 9/11 and 7/7 being inside jobs. They
were very much. This was all happening thick and fast. And this was an alert, saying a briefing note, saying, Houston, we have a problem here. Yeah. You know, there's so much information, if you know how to look for it, that's out there that offers compelling evidence, in my opinion, that the government have told massive lies on 9/11 and 7/7, the respective governments, and that in itself is a threat. So I was flagging this up, saying, look, we need to look at what's out there.
So this is 2 days before you were due to submit this report.
Right,
now, just read from the sheets that you prepared. You presented these to your superior officer. Rapidly growing body of Americans who no longer believe the Pentagon version of 9/11. The internet will ensure that the alternative version of events, and the one I believe, the inside job, gets promoted far and wide. There is huge potential for a total breakdown in trust between government and the masses. And then you cite a Charlie Sheen video, Jesse Ventura episode, 9/11 was the key witness murdered. You've also mentioned 9/11 NYPD, the first responder speaks out. And also you mentioned loose change, that's the 9/11. So you were kind of coming at it from the point of view of, hey, look, the people are seeing the truth and there are going to be a backlash against the government because of this, and you saw that as a potential threat to the police might have to look at.
Clearly that was relevant. Okay. I anticipated that there was a shift. It seemed clear that there was a growth of doubters, and that would actually at some stage come a tipping point. Right. And that if that, you know, with the internet, the power of the internet, such things can grow exponentially.
Yes.
And therefore that in itself would be a threat to community cohesion.
Yes.
So I was simply at this stage alerting, without necessarily taking a side, but alerting my management to a potential problem that I didn't think they would alert to.
Right, okay. Now, on 7/7, you said that there exists some very well documented research available on the internet to suggest that the 7/7 bombings were also an inside job, deliberately engineered to justify Prime Minister Tony Blair's decision to stand shoulder to shoulder with George Bush in the case for going to war in Iraq. There is a highly professional and determined movement from USA led by Alex Jones. That seems determined to get the truth out at all costs. The alternative version of events presented appear extremely plausible, especially if it is assumed that 9/11 was an inside job. Jones's message is likely to rapidly gain in strength through the use of YouTube and internet, especially if the US government's version of 9/11 becomes widely discredited, as I think it will be in the fullness of time. There will be a total outrage with the masses and a breakdown of trust between government and the population of the UK. So you saw the threat as becoming a conflict between people who were trying to find the truth about these events that they've been lied to, their false flag attacks. Okay, so what happened when you presented these to your officer?
Well, it certainly didn't go down very well. I took a couple of peer officers in the room and for the first time alerted management to this, and the doors were quickly shut.
So you wanted a couple of witnesses in there because you felt you said you were quite
undoubtedly
worried at that point.
When I first put my head above the parapet, which was on the 6th of July, it was with some understandable trepidation that I did this. And at this stage, I wanted somebody to see, other than the manager, to see this. So, but they were quickly moved out of the office, and I had a one-to-one with the director of intelligence, and we discussed this in an amicable way.
Now, they then told you to take a couple of days off.
No, not exactly. What happened was that the assignment was due on the 8th of July.
Yes.
And they wanted to make sure that I could deliver on the assignment to a board meeting that was taking place on the 8th of July. So their first primary concern seemed to be to make sure everything stayed on track for that.
Yes.
So the assignment that I was tasked to do, the Strategic Threat Assessment Matrix, they still wanted out, but they wanted it out in such a way that the alert that I'd given them had to be ignored. It couldn't be considered.
Right. Okay.
And that the terrorist threat still had to be consistent with the government narrative, i.e. the terrorist threat had to remain Islamic terrorism.
Yeah. Right. Now, at that point, is that when they then said, look, go away for a few days and write a report?
No, ironically, 5 years to the day, 7th of July, my other manager, a detective chief inspector, spent the day with me just to make sure that everything was on track for delivery of the product, the assignment. So we worked together, still of a mind that I was going to hand over a strategic threat assessment matrix that would actually be complicit in what I now believe to be a lie.
Right.
I felt sick as I was going through my work, because all of a sudden I'd had that paradigm shift whereby I could not, in my conscience, go along with this. But my managers didn't seem at all concerned. They just wanted that product delivered for the Intelligence Strategy Board and business could carry on as normal. They didn't want me to alert them to this issue. That's how it appeared. And for the one day and one day only, that was the 7th of July.
Last year, 2010.
I went along with that, and I was all prepared to deliver on the 8th of July, the full strategic assessment in accordance with what they want. But in my mind, it would have to go along with go with the lie. When I went home on the evening of the 7th of 7, a defining moment, my valley of decision came to me that evening. And I knew, conscience-wise, with the faith I have, I could not, in all honesty, go in and hand over my assignment, because to my mind, that would have made me complicit in the monstrous tyranny that had occurred in 9/11 and 7/7, because I would have been supporting the lie knowingly, given what I was now convinced was a monstrous lie, and conscience would not allow me to do that.